And it was. This was driven mostly by his very strong fiscal stimulus program. We talked a little bit about it last week. This included all these public works projects where where the government either hired people directly, like to be in the Civilian Conservation Corps, or in other parts of the Works Progress Administration, WPA. There were people who were hired directly by the government to do some work, and then there was lots of government contracting done to do things like build the Tennessee Valley Authority, all the dams and electrical generating stations and transmission lines and so on, to finally electrify basically Appalachia. So that fiscal policy worked. That's probably the best way to describe this. There was lots of spending, lots of money sort of trickling down, cascading. We had a multiplier effect that allowed us to have that money get used in a way several different times. And there were some other things that were going on here too that Roosevelt had and Congress had a hand in. We should give him credit for it. One was, and this is one of the last things I think we talked about on Thursday, one was trying to restore confidence in the banking system. If you remember, the other sort of storyline that we had here was that in addition to consumption and all of that going down, what we had was a drop in the money supply. We had a significant drop in the money supply, and that was largely due to bank failures. Banks failed. They had gone out on a limb, done a lot of speculating in the stock market, lost their corporate shirts when the stock market crashed, and so banks failed, and then there were runs in the bank, and for a variety of reasons, a lot of the banks failed. And when they failed, the money supply sort of collapsed in on them because they had accounts that had been there and now went up in smoke, and there wasn't anybody, the money wasn't there anymore. The other thing is that if you remember when we talked about money in the Federal Reserve and stuff, was that we had is this money multiplier thing, so that when somebody deposits money, only a portion of it gets held in reserves and the rest gets loaned out to somebody else. Well, if banks fail, not only do we lose their deposits, but we lose all of the lending activity and stuff that it might have generated. So we had a pretty significant contraction in the money supply. So that's stuff that was going on here. And then Roosevelt and Congress then took steps to try to turn that around. Now, they were not helped by the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve, especially early on, but I think even after things got better, the Federal Reserve had taken this attitude that they ought to let banks fail, that they were weak anyhow. We call this kind of a Darwinian survival of the fittest kind of an approach. And that's what the Fed wanted, fewer, stronger banks. They did not take into consideration or didn't agree this business about the money supply shrinking, and so that was still a problem. But one of the things that Roosevelt did, early on, what he had to do was actually declare a bank holiday, where he actually, where by national decree all the banks were closed, and that gave time for some banks to be taken over by, weaker banks to be taken over by stronger banks. Emergency infusions of cash being taken to some of the banks who were still healthy enough, but faced a possible run, and just to let things sort of settle down a little bit. The other thing that happened at this point was passage of the act that created the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and that provided insurance for depositors so that if they put their money in a federally chartered bank, then they knew that the odds were pretty good they would actually be able to get that money back even if the bank failed. All that was designed to try to restore confidence in the banking system. Now, the Glass-Steagall Act was also passed then, and we talked about that last week. That wasn't a public confidence sort of thing. It's not like the man on the street would say, "Oh, good, thank God, the Glass-Steagall Act's been passed. Now we can put our money back in." That wasn't the case, but that was an important sort of structural, behind-the-scene things to make sure the banks didn't get themselves into a risky position again. So some protection, the FDIC trying to get the banking system back and trust in it, money coming back in as deposits, lots of federal stimulus, and things started improving. We still had a big gap to match back to where we might have been if everything had been okay. But we saw some steady improvements. Still huge unemployment, 25%, I think was the maximum unemployment at some point. So still pretty desperate times, and nonetheless, things start going fine. But look at this blip. It doesn't look as very significant, but it actually was then. What happened is that as President Roosevelt was approaching his, 1938, which means he would have been running again for the second time, I think, if my date's right. But anyhow, as he was approaching it, he kind of got cold feet on this whole idea of increased government spending, larger government debt and stuff, and he pulled back in Congress, and they started reducing spending on government, reducing government spending, raising some taxes. There are some other things in here, and I haven't settled in my own mind whether they were really responsible for this other dip. But one of the political things that happened along the way here was that President Roosevelt, who was a Democrat, and he had his own political base he had to support, just like Hoover had the business industry to support, President Roosevelt had the unions to support. They were part of his political base, and they got a good number of sort of union favorable laws and regulations passed during this time, which was good on the one hand, a good protection for the workers. This was still early on in the union movement, and there had been lots of abuses of workers, and so to some extent they were good. But purely from an economic growth point of view, some of those things really slowed down growth potential by forcing employers to do things that maybe weren't quite so efficient. As I said, I haven't figured out in my own mind whether the net was good or bad on that, but it was stuff that was happening. So we had another little dip, and this really hurt. It doesn't seem as much, but we're still far below. And then there was this sense of really sort of cautious optimism. My gosh, little by little things are getting a little bit better. And all of a sudden it went down again, and that was really tough. What let us out the second time was not fiscal policy in the sense of the president and the Congress saying, let's go spend some more money, let's stimulate the economy. What let us out of this thing was World War II and the threat of Nazi Germany. Now, if you know your U.S. history, and for me it's, I'm okay on it, but not great. If you know your U.S. history, during this time period, we actually weren't in the war in 1939 and 40. We weren't in the war yet. It really wasn't until Pearl Harbor and shortly around there that we decided both to go to fight Japan, but also to fight Germany and Italy. But even so, the threat of, especially on the European front, the threat of Germany and its expansion all started us moving from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. We started making lots of war materials, ships and tanks and stuff like that. Early on, a lot of that stuff went overseas as part of a Lend-Lease program. It was our own soldiers and sailors and stuff weren't over there per se, but we were sending a lot of materials over, particularly to Britain, trying to protect Britain, making sure that it didn't fall to the Germans. So there was lots of economic activity here that allowed stimulated by the threat in Germany. This is to me, the interesting part of this story is that, as I said, sort of Roosevelt and Congress kind of got cold feet. They were worried about this growing government deficit. They thought they were going to face a lot of political opposition to it, so they backed off. And then what basically happened is that we had to start spending like there was no tomorrow and go into much deeper debt in order to put off the threat of war, or put off the threat in Germany. And so what the war really did was sort of mobilize public sentiment and say, yeah, we're really afraid of Germany. If we got to go into debt, that's the way it's got to be. We need to spend the money to build up our defenses. So what the war really was a was permission, if you will, from the populace to go ahead and go further into debt.